My name is Benjamin, and I filmed the scariest albino Bigfoot footage in history. A normal week turned into the most terrifying one of my life because what that creature did on camera is the worst anyone has ever been able to capture. I'm a 36-year-old field biologist taking short-term assignments documenting wildlife in remote areas whenever conservation groups need extra help. Most jobs end with a report explaining why a bear, elk, or mountain lion was mistaken for something else. The survey area covered a little over 12 square miles of dense forest that had produced nearly a dozen reports over the previous 8 months. The reports came from experienced hikers, hunters, and a pair of forestry workers who had all described roughly the same thing despite never speaking to one another. That's usually a good sign that there's at least something worth investigating. Most assignments like this end with a perfectly reasonable explanation, but every now and then you get one that keeps refusing to fit neatly into a box. Before doing any hiking, I marked every reported sighting on my GPS and picked out the locations that made the most sense for trail cameras. By early afternoon, I'd set up 5 cameras along game trails, creek crossings, and one narrow ridgeline where several witnesses claimed the white animal had crossed. I found plenty of deer tracks, a few black bear prints, and enough elk signs to explain why so many predators passed through the area. Around sunset, I climbed onto a rocky overlook that gave me a clear view of a small meadow below. It was exactly the kind of place a large animal might cross before dark. I spent nearly an hour behind the camera without seeing anything unusual and was already thinking about heading back to camp when something caught my eye near the tree line. A large white figure stepped into the opening and continued walking across the meadow at an unhurried pace. It never stopped, never looked around, and disappeared into the trees on the opposite side less than 10 seconds later. The footage wasn't nearly clear enough to identify what I'd just recorded, but it definitely wasn't what I'd expected to find out there. Back at camp, I transferred the footage onto my laptop and zoomed in frame by frame. The distance made it hard to pick out details, but one thing stood out immediately. The shoulders looked far too broad for a deer, and the way it moved didn't remind me of any bear I'd ever studied. It also didn't look like a person wearing white clothing, which ruled out the explanation I had been hoping for. I watched the clip several more times before comparing it with the witness reports I'd been given. Nearly all of them placed the sightings within a mile of where I'd been standing that evening. Whatever I'd filmed had followed the same route people had been describing for months. That was enough for me to extend the survey. I emailed the conservation group and told them I'd be extending the survey by a few days. At that point, all I expected to send back was better footage of an animal nobody had managed to identify yet. I reset my alarm for before sunrise, swapped out every battery I could, and planned to check the trail cameras first thing in the morning. The real work was just beginning. I left camp before sunrise and checked on the trail cameras. At 5:43 that morning, a large white figure entered the frame from the left and crossed the trail at a steady pace before disappearing into the trees less than 5 seconds later. It never paused or acknowledged the camera. The footage still wasn't clear enough to identify what I'd recorded, but it confirmed one important thing. Whatever this animal was, it had already passed through the survey area twice in less than 24 hours. That meant I finally had a pattern to work with. I spent the rest of the morning following the creek where the second camera had captured the white figure. The banks were soft enough to hold tracks, and before long, I found exactly what I'd been hoping for. I followed them upstream until the trees opened into a shallow crossing. That's where I saw it again. The white figure stepped into the water and crossed at an easy pace, giving me several uninterrupted seconds to film before disappearing into the timber on the opposite bank. I remember forcing myself not to adjust the zoom too much. One sudden movement was all it would take to lose the shot. Whatever I was filming never looked in my direction. It crossed the creek at an easy pace, climbed the opposite bank, and disappeared into the trees as quietly as it had arrived. I stood there for another minute, with the camera still pointed at the empty crossing, almost expecting it to come back. At the time, I thought that would end up being the most interesting footage I'd bring home. It wasn't even close. Back at camp, I started crossing possibilities off the list one by one. It wasn't a bear. The shoulders were too narrow, the legs were too long, and bears simply don't move with that kind of upright stride for more than a few steps. It wasn't a person either. The arms extended well below the waist, the body proportions were completely wrong, and no one wearing a costume could have crossed that rocky creek bed so effortlessly. Like everyone else, I'd heard the stories about Bigfoot over the years, but I never imagined I'd be sitting in my tent trying to explain an albino one. Albinism occurs in mammals, even if it's extremely rare, and there was no biological reason an undiscovered primate couldn't have the same condition. After ruling out every explanation that made sense, only one possibility fit what I was seeing. I was looking at an albino Bigfoot, and if I was right, it was one of the rarest animals anyone had ever recorded. Figuring out what it was felt like the biggest breakthrough of the trip. It turned out to be one of the least surprising things I would discover that week. I must have watched the footage 20 times before finally shutting the laptop. Every time I thought I'd found something that proved I was wrong, another detail pushed me back to the same conclusion. By the time I went to sleep, I wasn't trying to figure out what it was anymore. I was trying to figure out how to find it again. Knowing albinism can make animals more sensitive to bright sunlight gave me a place to start. If this thing shared even some of the same traits, it would probably spend more time under thick forest cover than out in the open. Instead of waiting near the meadow where I'd first seen it, I moved to a shaded creek crossing that stayed protected by the trees for most of the day. I also set up a small camouflage blind overlooking the area and switched to a longer lens so I could film from a distance without disturbing it. The waiting turned out to be the hardest part. Hours went by without so much as a squirrel wandering into frame, and I started wondering if I'd completely misread the area. Then, late that afternoon, movement caught my eye. The albino Bigfoot stepped out of the timber and walked straight through the crossing. I was thrilled with those recordings. If someone had told me I'd barely remember them by the end of the week, I never would have believed it. It never looked in my direction and seemed completely unaware I was there. I stayed in the blind for another hour hoping it'd come back, but it never did. Sitting inside that blind, I honestly felt like I'd finally figured it out. If the rest of the assignment went this smoothly, this might end up being a pretty good anniversary present for my wife after all. I backed up every clip onto a second memory card before turning in for the night. Losing a week's worth of footage because of a corrupted file would have been embarrassing enough. Losing what might have been the first convincing recording of an albino Bigfoot would have been even worse. I remember falling asleep thinking the hard part was finally behind me. After that, I stopped waiting for the albino Bigfoot to come to me and started following it instead. Every encounter lasted a little longer than the one before. It never ran, but it never stood still long enough for me to get close either. Whenever I thought I was about to lose sight of it, the white figure would appear again farther up the trail or between another stand of trees, almost as if it wanted to make sure I didn't turn around. More than once, I considered heading back to camp, but every new glimpse convinced me to keep going just a little farther. Looking back, that was probably the first mistake I made. At the time, though, it felt like progress. The longer I kept it in view, the better my chances of documenting behavior no one had ever recorded before. I had no reason to think I was doing exactly what the albino wanted. One encounter stood out more than all the others. I had stopped beside a fallen tree to steady my camera and crouched lower so I wouldn't lose sight of the albino through the brush. A few seconds later, it slowed down, turned slightly, and lowered itself into almost the same posture. I figured it was a coincidence until I started moving again. Instead of walking straight ahead, I stepped around the fallen trunk to get a better angle. The albino continued another few yards before circling around a different fallen tree in almost the same way. It wasn't copying me exactly, but the similarities were hard to ignore. I spent the rest of the afternoon trying to convince myself I was reading too much into it. Animals often mirror each other's behavior without any deeper meaning. Still, that explanation became harder to believe every time I replayed the footage. Something about the way it reacted felt less instinctive and far more deliberate. I remember sitting on a fallen log before heading back to camp and replaying that clip over and over. I'd spent years studying animal behavior, and I knew how easy it was to mistake coincidence for intelligence. The problem was that the more I watched, the harder it became to convince myself that was all I'd seen. The next morning, I made my usual rounds to check the trail cameras. Most of them had captured the same wildlife they'd been recording all week, but one clip immediately caught my attention. The albino Bigfoot walked into frame carrying a thick dead branch nearly twice its height. It wasn't dragging it behind or using it to clear a path. It carried the branch with both hands, crossed the trail, and disappeared into the trees without stopping. I replayed the clip several times, trying to figure out what I'd just watched. Large primates have been known to use branches as tools or even carry nesting material, so I didn't think much of it at first. I simply assumed I'd recorded another behavior that hadn't been documented before. I marked the exact time, camera number, and location in my notebook. If it happened again, I wanted to know whether there was a pattern. I copied the footage onto my laptop, replaced the camera's batteries, and headed back into the forest, still wondering where it had taken that branch. Later that afternoon, I found the albino again near the edge of a small clearing. I stayed well back and filmed through the trees, hoping to avoid pushing my luck. It seemed to tolerate my presence for a few minutes, but the moment I took a few careful steps closer, everything changed. The forest suddenly went quiet. Even the birds that had been calling all afternoon stopped at once. I remember thinking the silence felt wrong. Then the albino stopped walking, bent down, and grabbed a thick dead limb lying on the forest floor. In one motion, it swung the branch into the trunk of a nearby tree with enough force to split it clean in two. The crack echoed through the forest. It didn't charge or run. It simply stood there, watching me. Every instinct I had told me I'd crossed a line I wasn't supposed to cross. I kept the camera rolling for another few seconds, slowly backed away without taking my eyes off it, and didn't stop until there were several hundred yards between us. It was the first time since arriving that I felt less like I was documenting wildlife, and more like I'd just been warned. I honestly thought that would end up being the most intimidating thing I captured. But it wasn't. I seriously considered ending the assignment right there. I even started packing a few things around camp before talking myself out of it. The scientist in me kept insisting there had to be a reasonable explanation for what I'd witnessed. Curiosity won, and by the next morning, I was back out checking cameras again. The warning stayed in the back of my mind for the rest of the day, so I decided to check the trail cameras before heading back to camp. Most of them were uneventful, but one clip made me stop. The albino Bigfoot walked into frame carrying a heavy log across its shoulder before disappearing into the trees again. That raised a question I couldn't answer. Why was it carrying logs? It wasn't building a nest. It wasn't eating. It wasn't clearing a trail either. I replayed the footage over and over, hoping I'd missed something, but the clip ended before it reached its destination. Combined with the branch I'd seen the day before, it no longer felt like an isolated behavior. Whatever it was doing, it seemed deliberate. I just couldn't figure out the purpose yet. At the time, I assumed I was documenting. Another unusual behavior. I had no idea those few seconds of trail camera footage would eventually become some of the most important evidence from the entire expedition. My plan stopped working almost overnight. The shaded creek crossing that had produced my most promising footage stayed completely empty, and none of the trails I'd been following showed any fresh sign of the albino. I moved between every camera hoping it had simply changed its route, but they all came back with the same result. Nothing. That made me wonder if I'd gotten lucky, or if the albino had noticed the pattern before I did. Either way, I couldn't keep waiting in the same place anymore. If I wanted more footage, I'd have to start looking for it again instead of expecting it to come to me. I spent the rest of the afternoon moving cameras to new game trails and swapping memory cards. If the albino had changed its routine, I'd have to change mine too. Part of me wondered if I was giving the animal too much credit. Maybe I'd simply been lucky during those first few days, and now I was chasing patterns that didn't really exist. It wouldn't be the first time a field assignment had humbled me. I found it again the following afternoon, but this encounter only left me with more questions. The albino wasn't alone long enough for me to film anything unusual, but one of the trail cameras I collected that evening filled in the missing piece. It showed the albino walking through with several large rocks cradled against its chest before disappearing off the edge of the frame. Now I'd recorded it, logs and rocks, on 3 separate occasions. That wasn't something animals normally did without a reason. For a second, I actually wondered if it was building me a bench so we could sit down, share a drink, and talk about life. As ridiculous as that sounded, I couldn't come up with a better explanation. Whatever it was making, it clearly wasn't finished yet. Over the next 2 days, I kept seeing the same thing. Every time I checked a trail camera, the albino seemed to be carrying something different. One clip showed another heavy branch. Another captured it dragging a smaller log across the forest floor. A third ended just as it disappeared behind the trees with what looked like a pile of loose rocks. None of the cameras ever showed where it was taking any of it. They always stopped recording first. One clip showed it dragging another heavy log uphill with both hands before disappearing behind a stand of fir trees. Another captured it carrying several smaller branches tucked beneath one arm while balancing what looked like a flat rock in the other. Just like every recording before it, the footage ended a few seconds too early. I even hiked in the direction it had gone a few times, expecting to find some kind of shelter or nesting site, but there was nothing there. I even compared the timestamps from each camera, hoping they'd point to the same general area. Instead, they only confirmed that the albino was covering an incredible amount of ground between recordings. However it was moving through the forest, it knew the terrain far better than I ever could. By the fifth day, I finally caught another break. Fresh tracks led away from one of the creek crossings, and this time they hadn't been washed out overnight. I followed them carefully until I spotted the albino moving through the trees less than 50 yards ahead. It was the closest I'd ever been. I raised the camera and stayed exactly where I was, hoping not to repeat the mistake I'd made a few days earlier. I expected it to disappear the moment it noticed me. Instead, it glanced in my direction and kept walking at exactly the same pace. Not faster, not slower, almost as if it had already decided how close it was willing to let me get. Instead of disappearing into the forest like it usually did, the albino took a few slow steps to the side and waited. Once I started moving again, it did the same, always staying just far enough ahead to remain in sight. I should have turned around right then. Instead, I convinced myself I was finally documenting behavior nobody had ever recorded before. So I followed, careful to keep my distance, while the albino quietly led the way. Looking back, that's probably the moment the assignment stopped being mine. I thought I was deciding where to go next because I still had the camera in my hands. The reality was a lot less comforting. Every decision I made after that was based on wherever the albino wanted me to look. I didn't make it much farther before I noticed something else was wrong. I pulled out my GPS to mark the latest sighting and immediately realized I was several miles from camp. I'd been so focused on keeping the albino in view that I hadn't paid much attention to where it had been taking me. The quickest way back meant retracing my steps, so I turned around and started hiking in that direction. I hadn't gone more than 10 minutes when I froze. Standing on the trail ahead was the albino. It wasn't making any threatening movements. It simply stood there, watching me. I waited for it to leave, but it didn't. After a few minutes, I decided to take a different route instead. At the time, I told myself it was just another coincidence. Looking back, I don't think it was trying to stop me. I think it was waiting to see whether I'd choose the path it wanted. The alternate route lasted less than an hour. Just as I reached another narrow game trail, the albino stepped out from behind a cluster of cedars and stopped again. Different trail, same result. That's when I stopped believing it was coincidence. It wasn't following me from a distance, and it wasn't wandering through the forest at random. Somehow, it kept appearing exactly where I intended to go next. I backed away without taking my eyes off it and looked for a third route instead. The farther I walked, the quieter the forest seemed to become. Even the birds had gone silent. I told myself I was overthinking it, but one question kept coming back. If the albino already knew where I was going, where exactly was it trying to keep me from reaching? I spent the next half hour trying to work around it, but every route I picked seemed to funnel me back toward the same section of forest. The albino didn't appear every time, but it appeared often enough that I finally stopped pretending there wasn't a pattern. Then another trail camera gave me something else to think about. Earlier that afternoon, before I packed it away, it had recorded the albino dragging another long log in exactly the same direction as the others. It wasn't wandering while carrying those branches, rocks, and logs. It had a destination. Standing there with the camera in one hand and my GPS in the other, I couldn't shake a question that suddenly felt a lot more important than what the albino was building. Why was it spending so much time preparing one specific part of the forest? I stopped walking and listened. The forest had gone quiet again. No birds, no squirrels moving through the brush, just the wind pushing through the trees. I'd spent enough years working outdoors to know that kind of silence usually meant something nearby had every other animal on edge. Whether it was a mountain lion, a bear, or the albino, I wasn't interested in finding out which one. That was my cue to stop pretending this was just another survey. As much as I wanted to finish the assignment, I had a wife waiting at home and an anniversary I'd rather not miss. I also wasn't too excited about becoming the guy whose obituary read, "Contracted field biologist, killed while chasing a giant white ape through the woods." Search and Rescue confirmed they had my location and told me to stay exactly where I was while they sent a helicopter. At that point, whatever happened to the albino after that could be someone else's job. I found a small clearing and settled in to wait. There wasn't much else I could do until the helicopter arrived. After a few minutes, I started looking around more carefully, mostly to keep myself occupied. That's when I noticed something that hadn't registered before. Several fallen logs had been dragged into places that felt odd. A few large rocks were stacked along one side of the clearing, while thick branches filled gaps between clusters of trees. None of it looked unnatural on its own, but together it seemed strangely organized. I walked a slow circle around the area, and the more I looked, the less random it felt. There was really only one easy way in and one easy way out. Every other direction was cluttered with logs, brush, or rocks that forced you back toward the same narrow opening. Then I remembered every trail camera clip I'd collected over the last few days. The branches, the logs, the rocks. For the first time, I stopped asking myself what the albino had been carrying and started wondering where it had wanted me to end up. I walked the perimeter one more time, hoping I'd notice something that proved I was overreacting. I didn't. If anything, every step made the layout feel more intentional than the last. I backed up a few steps and looked at the clearing again, this time as if I were seeing it for the first time. The layout suddenly made sense. The logs hadn't fallen there naturally, the rocks weren't scattered at random, and the branches weren't just piled together. They had narrowed the area until there was only a single opening wide enough to move through comfortably. If someone, or something, walked into the clearing from the wrong direction, every other path forced them back toward that same gap. It wasn't a cage. I could still climb over the logs or push through the brush if I had to. It would just take time, more time than anyone would want if something was standing between them and the only easy way out. Then another thought hit me. Every encounter over the past few days had pulled me farther from camp and closer to this exact part of the forest. The albino hadn't been wandering. It had been leading me here. The branches, the logs, and the rocks suddenly meant something very different, piece by piece, day after day, right in front of my cameras, and I'd spent almost a week asking the wrong question. It had been building this, so much for sharing a drink and talking about life. Whatever the albino had been building, it definitely wasn't a bench. I stayed exactly where Search and Rescue had told me to, but the albino didn't leave. Every few minutes, I'd catch another glimpse of white moving between the trees before it disappeared again. It never came any closer, but it never wandered far either. The longer I watched, the more it felt like it was waiting for me to make the first move. Every instinct told me to stay put. If I walked back into the trees, I'd be doing exactly what it had spent the last several days trying to get me to do. So I kept the camera rolling and waited. For the first time since this assignment began, I wasn't trying to find the albino anymore. I was hoping the helicopter would find me first. Those next several minutes felt longer than the previous 5 days combined. Every rustle in the trees made me glance up from the camera, expecting the albino to step into the clearing again. Eventually, I heard the sound I'd been waiting for. At first, it was just a faint thumping somewhere beyond the mountains, but it grew louder with every passing second. The rescue helicopter circled once before spotting the clearing and lowering a rescue line. Relief hit me almost immediately. I clipped into the harness, kept my camera in one hand, and gave the crew a thumbs up. As I started rising above the trees, I instinctively pointed the camera back toward the clearing. If the albino was still nearby, this would be my last chance to film it. I had no idea those next few seconds would produce the clearest and easily the most disturbing footage of the entire assignment. The helicopter had barely settled into position when the albino finally stepped out from the trees. It wasn't looking at me anymore. Its attention was fixed entirely on the aircraft overhead. The constant noise immediately changed its behavior. It began pacing along the edge of the clearing, snapping branches beneath its feet and glancing up every few seconds. Then the searchlight swept across the trees and caught it in full view. The moment the beam reached the albino, it flinched, turned its head away from the light, and retreated several steps beneath the canopy. A few moments later, it cautiously stepped back into the clearing, only to retreat again as the spotlight passed over it. Watching the footage later, that was the first time I'd ever seen the albino lose its composure. For the first time since I arrived, the albino wasn't the one controlling what happened next. As the helicopter lifted me above the treetops, I kept the camera pointed toward the clearing below. From the ground, everything had looked like a mess of fallen timber and scattered rocks. From the air, it looked completely different. The logs, branches, and rock piles formed a narrow funnel that led into the exact spot where I'd been waiting. From above, I could even make out the alternate routes I'd tried taking earlier. They all narrowed into the same opening, blocked by the very logs and rock piles I'd spent days watching the albino carry through the forest. Every trail camera clip I'd collected over the past few days suddenly made sense. The albino hadn't been carrying those materials at random. It had been shaping the landscape one piece at a time. Then it stepped into the opening and looked up at the helicopter. The spotlight caught it again, forcing it back toward the trees, but before disappearing beneath the canopy, it stopped beside the entrance to the funnel and looked back one last time. That was the final piece I needed. It wasn't guarding a nest. It wasn't protecting a food source. It had stayed there because whatever it had built was finally finished. Looking down from the helicopter, I realized I hadn't been documenting the albino's behavior. I'd been documenting my own path into the trap it had spent days preparing for me. I did make it home in time for our anniversary, and my wife was right about one thing. I definitely came back with a story. I never accepted another assignment in that part of the forest, and I don't think I ever will.